Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. So imagine for just a second that the unthinkable actually happens. The grid goes completely down, a massive natural disaster hits, or you just find yourself totally isolated. Where does your mind go first? For a lot of folks, the immediate instinct is to jump straight to physical gear, right? We're talking the stockpiled food, the high-end water filters, the heavy-duty tactical backpacks. But what if I told you that surviving a true life-or-death disaster is actually way less about the physical tools stuffed in your bag and much more about the thoughts running through your head? Today, we're going to dive deep and reveal why disaster preparedness is, at its very core, a monumental psychological game.
To kick things off, I really want you to guess the absolute biggest danger you could face in an emergency. Like, if you were stranded out in the wild tomorrow, what is the deadliest threat? Most people immediately jump to starvation, or maybe freezing to death or running out of water. And honestly, that totally makes sense. Our bodies are pretty fragile after all. But when we actually look at the data and survival research, they point to a completely different silent killer.
Believe it or not, the absolute deadliest threat is panic. Panic is consistently ranked as one of the leading causes of death in emergency situations. It basically acts as this catastrophic mental domino effect. Think about it. One single fearful thought creeps into your mind, and you panic. That panic instantly clouds your judgment and totally short-circuits your ability to make sound decisions. So what happens? You make a rash choice, like abandoning a perfectly safe shelter or sprinting out into completely unknown terrain. That leads to an even worse situation, which just triggers more panic, and the whole cycle just keeps feeding on itself. It is literally a fatal chain reaction.
All right, so to help you avoid that fatal trap, here is our mental roadmap for this explainer. 1. The mental game of survival. 2. Anticipate, identify, manage. 3. Physical and mental fallout. 4. Crisis versus coping periods. And finally, 5. The will to survive. Let's get right into it. Starting off with Section 1, the mental game of survival, mind over matter.
Moving right along to Section 2, anticipate, identify, manage. This is your core survival strategy.
Look, you could literally have a bunker full of top-tier gear, but if your mind breaks, it's all completely useless. To build up that psychological armor, you have to master this continuous mental loop. First up, anticipate. You just have to accept the fact that you're going to be extremely stressed out and anxious. It's a totally natural human response, but expecting it ahead of time gives you a massive tactical advantage. Second, identify. You need to be able to recognize your body's physical tells. The rapid heart rate, the sweating palms, the tense muscles, and crucially, the negative self-talk that always follows. And third, manage. Once you identify that your mind is starting to spiral, you have to intervene. You use deep, focused breathing to calm those physical symptoms down, and you actively use positive self-talk to replace thoughts of "I can't do this" with "I'm prepared and I can absolutely handle this."
Next up is Section 3, physical and mental fallout. These are the villains of our story.
Now that you've got your mental weapon ready to go, we need to confront these villains. It's wild how intensely our bodies react to physical extremes. Take dehydration, for example. It doesn't just make your mouth dry, it severely tanks your physical performance and actually starts fueling irrational behavior. It scrambles your brain. Pain, on the other hand, is super fascinating. While it's basically your body screaming at you that something is very wrong, your brain can actually be trained to minimize or even completely dissolve that pain through intense concentration and adrenaline.
And this brings us to a huge point. Ignoring rest is incredibly dangerous. In a disaster, your adrenaline is pumping like crazy, and you might feel this overwhelming urge to just push through the exhaustion. But fatigue isn't just about feeling a little sleepy. Sleep deprivation breeds a nasty cascade of toxic psychological symptoms. We're talking severe irritability, extreme emotional volatility, and ultimately, reckless, careless decisions. A person pushed way too far by lack of sleep will literally jeopardize their own life simply because their brain can no longer process risk properly.
Then we've got the hidden villains. Get this, you might actually be surprised to hear that depression usually hits hardest not right in the middle of the crazy chaos, but right after you've secured your shelter, food, and water. Why? Because once that frantic survival work is done, you suddenly have way too much downtime. And that empty time allows your mind to just dwell on feelings of helplessness, isolation, and grief. That's exactly why survival experts highly recommend constantly keeping yourself busy, whether it's improving your shelter or just inventing little tasks, just to keep that depression at bay. And of course, we have to talk about fear. Unchecked fear is the sneaky villain that loves to create what we call fantasy disasters in your head. It makes you vividly imagine the absolute worst-case scenarios, which can quite literally paralyze you in your tracks. To survive, you must actively decide that the fearful feeling just isn't valid in that moment. You've got to tamp it down and force your brain to rely on your pure logic and your training rather than your runaway imagination.
But honestly, out of all these villains, hopelessness is hands down the most lethal emotional fallout you can possibly encounter. It's a pretty chilling reality. There are actual documented historical cases of people who literally willed themselves to die simply because they assumed surviving was impossible. They just gave up, withdrew into themselves, laid down, and passed away without any fatal physical injury whatsoever. It happened strictly because their mind decided the fight was over.
All right, moving on to Section 4. Crisis versus coping periods. This is a turning point.
So any disaster timeline basically splits into two very distinct phases. First, you've got the crisis period. That happens right when the disaster actually strikes. It is pure chaos. Shock completely rules your body. Your thoughts are totally jumbled, and there's just disorganization everywhere. But here's the thing. Your survival depends entirely on how quickly you can transition out of that phase and into the coping period. This is the critical turning point where reality finally sinks in. You accept the pain and the discomfort, you practice extreme patience, and you consciously take back control of your emotions rather than letting them control you.
And finally, Section 5, the will to survive, the ultimate climax.
Once you've managed your fear and made it into that coping phase, you can start tapping into something that's honestly almost superhuman. We are talking about the raw, incredible power of sheer determination, a force that can override the harshest, most brutal elements on Earth. There are documented true-life cases of survival where a person literally ate their own leather belt just for some kind of nourishment. Another person boiled a leather boot in water just so they could drink the broth. It's wild. That intense, burning desire to live completely rewrites the rules of what we consider normal or even possible.
Just to put this into perspective, consider this stark reality. There was a man who was lost in a brutal desert environment for 8 long days without a drop of food or water. He ended up losing 25% of his total body weight. The dehydration was so profoundly severe that his blood actually became too thick to bleed when he suffered cuts. Medically speaking, he should not have been walking. He shouldn't have been alive. Yet his unbreakable psychological determination, his pure raw will to survive, just kept his legs moving until he was finally rescued.
But now, I want you to juxtapose that sheer willpower against an incredibly tragic story. A pilot crash-landed his plane. He actually survived the crash, completely intact, no major injuries. He even spotted a shoreline off in the distance that would have provided him with food, water, and shelter. But he looked at that distance, completely succumbed to an overwhelming feeling of hopelessness, walked right back to his plane, and tragically took his own life. And the truly devastating part of all this, a rescue team arrived at his plane just 24 hours later. He had literally every physical advantage going for him, but his mind gave up.
So, as we wrap up this explainer today, I really want to leave you with this final provocative thought. We spend so much time, energy, and money prepping our physical supplies, right? We're buying the right boots, storing up the right freeze-dried food, building the ultimate bug-out kits. But if disaster strikes tomorrow, are you actually taking the time to practice the psychological resilience that will really save your life? Because at the end of the day, when the gear fails and the elements start closing in, your mindset is literally the only survival tool you have left. So, start training your mind today.